This is episode 2 of Project Ungoverned, the online learning landscape. In part 1 of this episode, we'll look at new ways of teaching and online learning.
This is Project Ungoverned, a podcast looking at the brave new world of online education, new ways of learning, new ways of teaching, and the promise of unprecedented access to education.
The boom in new education technology has sparked a gold rush, attracting new companies, global institutions, and investors. But who creates the rules of engagement and who enforces them? Is online learning ungoverned? I'm Nicole Harkin, an award-winning writer and former good government analyst.
And I'm Dr. Kim Ochs, an education strategist specializing in EdTech and international education. Together in this 6-episode podcast series, we talk to educators, learners, visionaries, and pioneers in online education from across the globe to look at the possibilities, challenges, and governance of online learning.
Will online learning revolutionize educational access and opportunity?
Or will it accelerate a downward spiral in educational quality?
And what role will governance and related issues such as accountability, transparency, and inclusiveness play in determining the outcome? Join us as we explore the landscape of online education.
In part 1 of this 2-part episode, we look at an example of online education that showcases new ways of teaching and reflects the diverse partnerships involved in creating and delivering online education. We also look at what types of good governance are needed to ensure consistent educational quality.
We spoke with Emily Goering, who is an implementation specialist responsible for an innovative online program for social workers, clinicians, and mental health providers working across the United States. We asked her to tell us about her work and program.
I work for an organization that typically provides some specialized clinical services and has tried to broaden their reach by also providing some trainings to professionals. So we work specifically with kids that have faced trauma, been in foster care, been adopted, or had other unstable sort of family situations. The organization started with doing some in-person trainings and then has gone into the area of online training in the last 5 years. So it's relatively new endeavor for them. So we're working with social workers, clinicians, mental health providers that don't necessarily sit in an office every day from 9 to 5 and have really busy and, overrun schedules. So this training was a really good fit for our population because they're not necessarily able to get to an in-person training. And so we've had over 6,000 users pilot our trainings.
We asked Emily why her organization started doing trainings online to serve their population.
So some of the challenges for state government workers and social workers that are in the field is that they maybe have a certain training that they're required to go to at some point in their employment, but maybe it's only offered once or twice a year at a centralized location that's hours away from where they are. This obviously solves that sort of location issue where someone who's far away can just easily access the training whenever they have internet. But also, these employees are often driving around and in their car a lot, so their office is often in their car. And this allows them to sort of access the training as they can. So if someone cancels an appointment, they could log into the training and take a module or take a lesson. And that's sort of another thing that we did with the design is that we know that these are employees that are really overworked and have really high caseloads. And so when we developed the modules, there are modules within the training and then there are lessons within each module. And we developed it so that each lesson is only 30 minutes long. In theory, if you had a 30-minute block, you could go in and just do one 30-minute lesson, and the training system will track it. And next time you can come in and do the next lesson. It was designed to try to accommodate their busy work schedules.
It's clear that the online delivery met the needs of social workers for flexible learning. But how was the training designed? Emily explained what went into the training curriculum and how the content was developed.
The training development, it was multi-phased. But really, the basis of the development was bringing together people in the field that have a lot of expert knowledge around this content area. So, well-known people in the field as well as consumers, so people that would benefit from the training. There was a lot of feedback on identified issues, training gaps, knowledge gaps. And then from there, they developed learning objectives and sort of the outline of what the content should be. And I think they probably did some member checking, meaning they went back to their advisors and their groups many times throughout this process and sort of verified if they were on the right track. We hired curriculum writers to then do all the heavy lifting in terms of the development of the training. So, writing out what should be in the training, what the format, what all the content should be. And then we had a separate production team. So, based on what the curriculum writers developed, we had a team that actually produced the online content. So, these were experts in, learning management systems, people that could basically take that what was on paper from the curriculum and put it into some sort of interesting, interactive online training platform using adult learning principles. So, people definitely had different expertise throughout the process. For instance, our curriculum writers really have no ability to create anything online. They just have a lot of experience and expertise in the content area. So the production team was really critical then in creating this online platform that was a well done, well put together online training.
This approach to course design went well beyond the traditional model of individual instructor developing and delivering the course. This was a team approach and process. Content experts and end users brainstormed and identified essentials. Curriculum writers, who were experts in adult learning and could structure the content effectively, and a production team of experts in technology to make things accessible.
And was this team approach effective? So, how did they assess the learner's work and progress?
There are pre-tests and post-tests throughout that are reviewed, and they have to pass those with a certain score. And if they don't, they get an opportunity to retake it. But if they fail it multiple times, they actually then have to contact the folks that host our LMS system and ask them to reset their tests. And they'll be given instructions that they need to go back and review the content because obviously they haven't absorbed it. We suspect that maybe some people are taking screenshots of the test questions and then saving those correct answers so that and then they get to the post test. They have all those questions there. But I think that's going to be true of any classroom setting. There are always going to be those that want to get around the requirements or flat out cheat.
Looking beyond assessing knowledge, Emily explained her team also evaluated impact as well as quality.
We've really tried to assess not just are they gaining knowledge. The harder part to evaluate is are they translating that learning into practice changes and into changes in how they do their jobs, how they work with families. And we definitely are getting that feedback from them that people are seeing an impact in the ways that they're doing their work. And they're able to articulate to us specific things from the training that they're using. And so that's really encouraging when someone can pull out of a 20 to 30-hour training. I use this exact tool that you mentioned in module 5 with children and families. I've used that tool. So that to us is a really strong indicator that people are actually making some practice changes based on what they're learning in our training. Quality falls into a couple of different categories. I mean, the quality of the content of the learning objectives and the content was really probably overseen by our advisory group. But then there's also that quality of the online training. So the actual training modules and the system that people are interacting with. Is it high quality? Are the images nice? Is the sound nice? Does the sound work? Do the different interactions within the training work? Do people understand them? That quality, the more technical online training quality, was overseen by our production team. And then, of course, they would also get feedback from our users and from our team that piloted the training.
As Emily pointed out, some of the challenges with quality she saw in the online learning environment were actually quite similar to those in a traditional learning setting or in a brick and mortar classroom.
I think the issues with online training and in-person training are the same. If you are in a low quality classroom setting, you're not going to get the education that you need. The same is true for online. And I think we need to continue exploring that more. And really, the question is more about quality in both settings. I mean, the same is true for the outdated information, right? I think last time we talked about this idea of a syllabus. I think we all know professors that got their PhD 30 years ago, and they have had the same syllabus and taught the same class with very little updates for 30 years. That's just as problematic as an online training that's sitting out there that hasn't been updated.
We asked Emily what support they provided to the learners, or how did learners support each other.
People would turn the online training into an in person, almost classroom like environment. And they would get together and take the training together on their individual laptops. But then they could, pause it or after a lesson, have group discussions. So they created sort of a hybrid course on their own, so that they had both that social in-person interaction, but then they were actually doing the content of the training online.
These were some illuminating examples of how learners adapted the training to their learning styles and preferences. I know when I was working in government, we often had to do online trainings, and everyone thought they were a waste of time. Emily discussed with us the surprises and misconceptions employees raised about the training her organization developed.
I think there were a lot of misconceptions. The biggest one probably was that because it's online, it's going to be easier. And people did not believe us when we told them that this is a 20-hour training. I think people thought they could just turn it on and do their work, do their real work, and that they could just sort of let it play in the background. And then they could pretty easily pass the tests and get the credit. And so, overwhelmingly, the number one complaint about the training has been it just takes so long. And we think that we're probably pretty accurate in terms of this being a 20-hour training. And I think also we realize that there needs to be a lot of education around how you take an online training. So this is not something that you just sit in your cubicle and respond to emails while you listen to it. You actually need to think about not just having protected time to take the training, but also having protected space to take the training, just like you would in person. So we did find some of our participants and organizations that participated would give their employees 2 hours every morning to work on the training. But the problem was if they were still sitting in their cubicle, their phone was still ringing and their emails were still popping up on the side of their screen. And so actually, they needed to go a step further and not just give those 2 hours of protected time every day, but then they needed to rent a or reserve a conference room so that their employee could go sit somewhere else besides their desk and actually focus on the training and fully interact with the content. So I think that was the number one misconception. I think people don't always realize the amount of resources it takes to develop online trainings. I think people think a lot about the upfront costs around development of online training. And they think about, they need a lot of technical expertise. It's a big upfront investment, but then they think, okay, then the training will just be there. You have to think about these offshoot products that actually help support the learner. You have to think about, those updates and how much the updates are going to cost and how often you should do the updates. Our funder, I think, kind of just thought, okay, we'll infuse a large amount of money to develop a great high quality training, and the information will be relevant forever. Obviously, that's not really realistic. Even if we do try to make it so that it's not dated, so that we don't mention dates, we have really tried to be thoughtful of that. Even the shirts that people are wearing in their interviews are going to alert someone to the fact that this training was maybe created 10 years ago. So, it's not just relevant forever and ever.
At the end of the day, both the end user and the organization grossly underestimated time, the time they needed to take, develop, and maintain the training. Another point Emily made here is the importance of having protected time and space to learn online. Online education requires full concentration. Online should not mean distracted training or multitasking. Besides time management skills, what else do people need to be successful online learners?
People definitely need incentives. That's a big part of it. You can provide someone with a free opportunity for online education, but if they don't have an incentive to complete it, and that incentive could be financial, it could be some other intangible. It could be some kind of internal motivation, but there has to be an incentive around the training completion. Otherwise, people won't prioritize it. If your organization mandates you take the training, it's really going to help get the user to complete it because your job depends on it. We asked a question on some of our surveys: was this training mandated for you to take? We got some number like 80% saying that it was a mandated training for them. I mean, 50% or less were mandated. A lot of the agencies really didn't have the ability to mandate the training, but people thought that it was mandated. And so that got them to finish it. The continuing education credits that they get through their organizations or through their licensing boards, for if they have a professional like social work or clinical license, those are a huge motivator for people. But part of the problem that we found is that in a lot of states and jurisdictions, you can only have a certain number of hours online as a part of your CEUs. So many of them say, oh, you can only have 10 hours of online education for your annual CEUs. And with a 20-hour training, obviously, then they're doing 10 CEUs that won't get to count towards their professional license. Some interesting things that actually became motivators for people in the training is that people thought that they were sort of being watched by someone on the other end of the computer. And we would get people that would ask us how much they were supposed to write in terms of a response to the question, or if we could provide them with feedback, or if they got the question right. We didn't realize that people would think they were actually being graded on every element of the training.
So, creating incentives and motivators doesn't appear to be easy in this situation. Mandating a training requires resources, and awarding credits requires cross agency coordination. Feedback could also be a motivator for online learners, or even presumed feedback that would actually never be provided. In traditional education, we're often conditioned to do work for a grade, and some of these ideas seem to carry over into the online environment. We then transition to discussing governance in online education with Emily.
So we don't have any sort of official governing body that says, this is legitimate training education, but we do have to get it approved by continuing education bodies. And so if this were a training that was providing misinformation or was really poor quality, or we had people that had developed it that really had no expertise in the field, then it would not get approval for continuing education. So while we don't have the training accredited by a certain accreditation body, we do have the continuing education hours approved by different boards and different, state licensing entities. So I think that does help in terms of quality. And I do think that online training, at least in my field, which is in, child welfare and mental health, is still in its infancy, and people really are still question its legitimacy. We have a long way to go, and there isn't a lot of governance around it other than there are some, arbitrary decisions being made about how much of your training can be in person versus how much of your training can be online. So, some of these accrediting or these licensing bodies are saying that you can only have a certain number of training hours that are online. I think that they've set these restrictions around how much online training you can have just because it's to them new and unknown. So I do think we need to get to a place where we can sort of better evaluate what are people actually learning, and if it's just as good or better online, then they should be allowed to get professional development that way.
Assessing equivalency between online and traditional course content remains a challenge, particularly in non formal education programs like Emily's. In accredited higher education courses, as we'll discuss in a later episode, we have something called the Carnegie Unit and some course calculators that are often used by curriculum developers. But professional education is assessed differently by different boards and stakeholders.
That all makes sense and relates to the issue of legitimacy of online programs that we discuss with Emily next.
I think that in some ways, folks like us, my organization, are helping with that establishment of legitimacy because I think first the field needs to see that there are high quality, effective ways to access professional development online. And so just seeing a training that really has an impact on people can help bring the field along. So I think that as more online education is out there, that's good, that the rest of the field will, follow suit in terms of their buy-in. And online social work programs, just like in any academic setting, are becoming more and more common. So I think it's here to stay. It's just a matter of showing its usefulness and its effectiveness and why we need it.
Here are a few summary takeaways from Emily's interview. First, good governance can also lead to creating incentives and improving completion rates. Second, receiving continuing education credits was a huge motivator for people, but the point Emily raised is that there is a current limitation to the number of credits that can be awarded for online programs. Third, part of the dialogue that needs to happen here among stakeholders includes how to assess the quality of an online course versus a traditional course for professional training.
Emily identified some important misconceptions about online learning. Flexible learning doesn't mean multitasking. The ability to learn everywhere doesn't mean you always can. You still have to allocate time and what Emily called protected time to do the learning. In episode 1, Matt Dull brought up the idea of self-governance. The learner has to assess the real expectations of their program, structure their learning environment, and allocate the resources necessary. And with Emily's program, participants self-organized small groups to learn together in the same space.
The online space is different from the in-person space. Other distractions, like laundry in the refrigerator, call to the student. In our upcoming episode 3, we will look at how one organization chose to actively prepare students for how to study online.
An online course has a shelf life because the information isn't relevant forever. And from a governance perspective, particularly where regulation changes as it does in the field of social work and mental health, updates need to be budgeted and planned for. Finally, one person alone cannot create an online course. Diverse expertise is required, which in this case included subject matter experts who are experienced professionals, course writers, technical experts, teachers, and engaged students.
Legitimacy is another theme that came up. In this area of counseling, online education still needs to establish legitimacy. And while her program is helping to do that, an issue to think about is how stakeholders can work together to establish legitimacy. As we were reminded in episode 1, governance is a process. It's a relationship.
Some questions from our discussion with Emily we want to take forward to our symposium are: how can we establish legitimacy in online non-formal education? Is it through demonstrated impact? And when you look at online learning programs that fall under the category of non-formal education, who are the real stakeholders involved? And is the network broader than it first appears? You can find the links, show notes, and learn about our upcoming virtual symposium on the 24th of January, 2019 on our website at projectungoverned.com. If you're enjoying this podcast series, please subscribe, rate, and review Project Ungoverned on iTunes.
That's it for episode 2, part 1 of the Project Ungoverned podcast. Tune in for episode 2, part 2, where we visit with Julie Murat from Bridge for Billions about new ways of teaching and learning online. Project Ungoverned takes place within the Bosch Alumni Network, a network which consists of people who've been supported in one way or another by the Robert Bosch Stiftung. The network is coordinated by the International Alumni Center, IAC Berlin, a think and do tank for alumni communities with social impact. The IAC supports this podcast series and symposium. If you want to know more about the power of networks, visit iac-berlin.org.